The gym echoed with the sound of laughter and heavy breathing as Marcus Chin stepped through the glass doors of Elite Combat Training Center. At 22 years old, he looked younger than his age, with a lean build that seemed almost fragile compared to the muscle-bound fighters scattered throughout the facility. His black hair was neatly trimmed, and, behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his dark eyes took in every detail of his new training environment. Marcus had just completed his basic Navy training 3 weeks ago. The recruiter had promised that his next assignment would involve advanced combat training, but Marcus had expected something more formal, more structured. Instead, he found himself in what looked like a high-end civilian gym that specialized in mixed martial arts and self-defense training. The facility was impressive. Heavy bags hung from reinforced ceiling mounts, while speed bags rattled under the rapid strikes of experienced fighters. Multiple fighting rings occupied the center of the space, surrounded by weight training equipment that looked like it belonged in a professional athlete's training facility. The walls were covered with photos of fighters, some professional, others clearly military personnel in various uniforms. "You must be the new guy," said a voice behind him. Marcus turned to see a man in his 30s approaching, wearing an instructor's shirt with the gym's logo. "I'm Steve Martinez, head instructor here." "You're Chen, right? Navy sent you over for some additional training before your next assignment." Marcus nodded, adjusting his gym bag on his shoulder. "Yes, sir. I was told to report here for combat training enhancement. Though I have to admit, I was expecting something more like a military facility." Steve chuckled, a sound that held more amusement than warmth. "Don't worry, kid. We get plenty of military guys through here. Some of them even manage to keep up with our regular fighters." His tone suggested that this was rare. "Why don't you get changed and we'll see what the Navy taught you?" As Marcus made his way to the locker room, he could feel eyes following him. Conversations seemed to pause as he passed, and he caught fragments of whispered comments. "Another military kid. Look at those glasses. What's he going to do, calculate his way out of a fight? I give him 10 minutes before he's crying for his mommy." The locker room was spacious and well-maintained, with individual lockers and a separate area with benches. Marcus chose a locker in the corner and began changing into his training gear. His movements were methodical and quiet, a habit developed during his military training where drawing unnecessary attention was rarely beneficial. As he laced up his training shoes, 3 men entered the locker room. They moved with the confident swagger of people who owned their environment, their conversation loud and filled with casual arrogance. The largest of the 3 was built like a linebacker, with massive shoulders and arms covered in tattoos that spoke of various martial arts achievements. His name tag read Tony, and, from his bearing, Marcus guessed he was one of the gym's star fighters. "Check it out," Tony said, nodding toward Marcus. "Fresh meat just arrived." The second man was leaner but moved with the fluid grace of someone trained in multiple fighting disciplines. "Looks like another military washout. They keep sending them here hoping we can teach them how to actually fight." The third member of the group had the scarred knuckles and flattened nose of someone who had spent years in serious combat sports. "Remember the last one? That Marine who thought his boot camp training made him tough? He lasted exactly 4 minutes in the ring with Tony before he was begging to tap out." Marcus continued tying his shoes, his expression neutral. He had learned during basic training that responding to provocation usually made situations worse, not better. These men were clearly trying to get a reaction from him, and the best response was often no response at all. "Hey, glasses," Tony called out directly to Marcus. "You hear us talking to you?" Marcus finished with his shoes and stood up slowly, turning to face the 3 men. "I heard you. I just didn't think you were talking to me specifically." This response seemed to amuse them even more. Tony stepped closer, using his size advantage to create an intimidating presence. "Oh, we're talking to you, all right. See, we've got a little tradition here. New guys, especially military new guys, they get a welcome session. Helps us figure out what level of training they need." "That sounds reasonable," Marcus replied evenly. "When would you like to schedule that?" The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such a calm response. Most new arrivals, especially younger ones, would either back down completely or get aggressive. Marcus was doing neither. "How about right now?" suggested the lean fighter. "We've got ring 2 free, and there's usually a good crowd around this time of day. Makes for better training when you've got an audience." Marcus considered this. He had been planning to start with some basic conditioning and get familiar with the equipment, but he understood that every training environment had its own culture. If this was how things worked here, fighting it would likely make his time more difficult. "All right," he said simply. "Should I grab protective gear, or how do you usually handle these welcome sessions?" Tony grinned, showing teeth that had clearly seen their share of impacts. "Oh, we keep it light for the first time. Just basic sparring. Nothing too serious. We're not trying to hurt anybody on their first day." Something in his tone suggested this wasn't entirely true, but Marcus simply nodded. "Understood. Lead the way." The group made their way back into the main training area, where Marcus noticed that word of the upcoming match had already spread. Fighters were gathering around ring 2, some continuing their own training while keeping one eye on the proceedings. Others had stopped their workouts entirely to watch. Steve Martinez appeared at ringside, now wearing the expression of someone who had seen this scenario play out many times before. "All right, gentlemen, if we're doing this, we're doing it right. Standard sparring rules: 3-minute rounds, tap out or verbal submission ends it immediately. No strikes to the back of the head, no eye gouging, no groin shots." He looked directly at Marcus. "You sure you want to do this, kid? These guys have been training here for years. There's no shame in waiting a few weeks, getting some basics down first." Marcus appreciated the offer, but he also understood that backing down now would set a tone for his entire time at the facility. "I appreciate the concern, sir, but I think I'll be fine." "Your funeral," Tony said, climbing through the ropes into the ring. "Hope the Navy taught you how to fall properly." Marcus removed his glasses and handed them to Steve, then climbed into the ring. Without the glasses, his vision was somewhat limited, but he had trained extensively in situations with reduced visibility. It was another aspect of military preparation that civilian fighters might not expect. The crowd around the ring had grown to nearly 20 people. Marcus could hear side conversations and what sounded like informal betting on how long he would last. The general consensus seemed to be that it would not be very long. Tony moved to the center of the ring, rolling his shoulders and cracking his knuckles in an obvious display meant to intimidate. He outweighed Marcus by at least 50 pounds, and his reach advantage was significant. More importantly, he moved with the confidence of someone who had dominated many previous opponents. "Ready when you are, military boy," Tony called out. Steve looked at both fighters. "Protect yourselves at all times, listen to my instructions, and remember this is training, not a death match. Touch gloves and come out fighting." The two fighters moved to the center of the ring. Tony extended his gloves with a smirk that suggested he was already planning his victory celebration. Marcus met him halfway, touching gloves briefly before both fighters returned to their corners. "Time," Steve called out. Tony immediately moved forward, using his size and reach to pressure Marcus toward the ropes. His strategy was obvious and effective against most opponents: use superior physical attributes to overwhelm and intimidate, forcing mistakes that could be capitalized on quickly. Marcus gave ground, but his movement was controlled rather than panicked. He kept his hands up and his feet mobile, occasionally slipping punches rather than blocking them directly. To the crowd, it looked like he was already in trouble, struggling to avoid Tony's aggressive attack. "Come on, glasses," Tony taunted between combinations. "I thought the military was supposed to teach you guys how to fight. All you're doing is running away." The crowd laughed and shouted encouragement to Tony. Several voices called out suggestions for how to finish the fight quickly. The atmosphere was turning into something closer to a gladiatorial exhibition than a training session. Marcus continued to move, occasionally throwing light jabs that Tony easily avoided or blocked. His attacks seemed tentative, almost hesitant, which drew more laughter from the crowd. To most observers, it looked like exactly what they had expected: a young military recruit who was completely outclassed by an experienced civilian fighter. What they couldn't see was that Marcus was mapping Tony's movement patterns, timing his combinations, and identifying the small gaps in his defense that appeared when he got aggressive. Military training had taught him that the first priority in any engagement was intelligence gathering, and that applied to individual combat as much as it did to larger tactical situations. Tony, encouraged by what appeared to be easy dominance, began to get more aggressive and less careful. His combinations became longer, his movement more predictable, and his defense more casual. This was exactly what Marcus had been waiting for. As Tony threw a particularly aggressive combination, leaving himself slightly off balance and overextended, Marcus finally acted. What had appeared to be tentative movements suddenly became precise and explosive. He slipped inside Tony's guard, delivered 3 quick strikes to the body that folded the larger man slightly, then followed with an uppercut that lifted Tony onto his toes. The crowd's laughter died instantly, replaced by surprised silence. Tony staggered backward, his expression changing from confident amusement to shocked confusion. He had expected this fight to be over by now, with the military kid either unconscious or begging to stop. Instead, he found himself hurt and off balance, facing an opponent who suddenly looked completely different. Marcus didn't press his advantage immediately. Instead, he returned to his mobile, defensive style, but now the crowd could see the controlled precision in his movement. What had looked like fear or inexperience now appeared to be careful calculation. "Lucky shot," Tony muttered, shaking his head to clear it. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence. He came forward again, more cautiously this time, but Marcus was ready. The military training that the crowd had dismissed was beginning to show itself. This wasn't the flashy, sport-oriented fighting they were used to seeing. This was something more direct, more purpose-built for actually stopping opponents rather than impressing judges or crowds. Tony threw a jab followed by a cross, both technically sound punches that would have been effective against most opponents. Marcus slipped the jab and caught the cross on his forearm, then responded with a strike to Tony's solar plexus that drove the air from his lungs and left him gasping. Before Tony could recover, Marcus followed with a sweep that took his legs out from under him. The larger man hit the mat hard, and suddenly, Marcus was in a dominant position, controlling Tony's movement and looking for a submission hold. The crowd was now completely silent. This was not how these welcome sessions usually went. Tony, to his credit, had enough experience to know he was in serious trouble. He tried to power out of Marcus's control, using his size advantage to create space, but every movement seemed to put him in a worse position. The young man he had expected to dominate was controlling the fight with a technical precision that suggested far more training than basic military combat instruction. "Time," Steve called out, though it was unclear whether the 3 minutes had actually elapsed or whether he was ending the round early. Both fighters returned to their corners. Tony was breathing hard and had a confused, almost angry expression. His 2 friends were leaning over the ropes, speaking to him in urgent whispers. Marcus simply sat on his stool, breathing easily and showing no signs of fatigue or stress. He looked calm, almost relaxed, as if this was exactly what he had expected to happen. The crowd around the ring was buzzing with confused conversation. The easy entertainment they had expected was turning into something much more serious and unexpected. Several of the more experienced fighters were watching Marcus with new interest, recognizing techniques and movement patterns that suggested training far beyond basic military combat courses. Steve approached Marcus's corner. "You doing okay, kid? You want to call it here? You've already proved your point." Marcus looked up at him with a slight smile. "I'm fine, sir. If Tony wants to continue, I'm ready for round 2. Across the ring, Tony was indeed ready to continue, though his motivation had shifted from entertainment to something closer to personal pride. He had been made to look foolish in front of his home gym, and that was not something he could let stand. "Round 2, Steve announced, though his tone suggested he was beginning to have second thoughts about this entire exercise. This time, Tony came out much more carefully. Gone was the casual aggression and obvious telegraphing of his attacks. He moved like someone who had finally recognized that his opponent was dangerous. Marcus, for his part, seemed to have shed whatever restraint had characterized his performance in the first round. His movement was more aggressive, his attacks more direct. The crowd could now see that what they had interpreted as defensive weakness had actually been careful evaluation. The two fighters engaged in a much more technical exchange. Tony's size and reach advantages were real, and his years of training at this gym had given him solid fundamentals. But Marcus was demonstrating skills that seemed to come from a completely different kind of training environment. Where Tony's techniques were designed for sport fighting, with consideration for rules and point scoring, Marcus's approach was more direct and goal-oriented. His strikes targeted specific vulnerabilities, his positioning was designed to limit Tony's options rather than create impressive displays, and his overall strategy seemed focused on ending the fight as efficiently as possible. The crowd was beginning to understand that they were not watching a typical gym sparring session. This was starting to look like something much more serious. Tony landed a solid punch to Marcus's ribs, but instead of backing away or showing pain, Marcus used the moment of contact to trap Tony's arm and execute a throw that sent the larger man crashing to the mat again. This time, Marcus followed him down immediately, looking for a finishing hold. Tony managed to scramble away, but he was clearly becoming frustrated and tired. His earlier confidence was completely gone, replaced by the desperate movements of someone who was beginning to realize he was outmatched. The fight continued for another minute before Marcus finally secured a rear naked choke. Tony fought the hold for several seconds, but the technical precision with which it was applied made escape impossible. Eventually, he tapped out, and Steve immediately called for the fighters to separate. The gym was completely quiet as both men got to their feet. Tony looked humiliated and angry, while Marcus simply nodded respectfully to his opponent and began walking toward the ropes. "Where the hell did you learn to fight like that?" Tony demanded, his voice carrying across the silent gym. Marcus paused and turned back. "The Navy taught me what I needed to know." "Bullshit," Tony shot back. "Basic military training doesn't teach you to fight like that. Nobody learns that level of technique in basic boot camp." Marcus retrieved his glasses from Steve and put them back on, transforming his appearance back to that of a mild-mannered young man who looked like he should be studying in a library rather than dominating experienced fighters. "You're right," he said quietly. "Basic training doesn't teach you to fight like that." He gathered his gear and began walking toward the locker room, leaving behind a crowd of confused and somewhat shaken fighters. The easy entertainment they had expected had turned into something that challenged their understanding of what they thought they knew about military training and their own abilities. As Marcus disappeared into the locker room, conversations erupted around the gym. Some fighters were trying to figure out exactly what they had just witnessed, while others were beginning to reconsider their assumptions about military personnel in general. Tony stood in the middle of the ring, still breathing hard and looking like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. His two friends were trying to offer explanations and encouragement, but their words seemed hollow in the face of what everyone had just seen. Steve Martinez stood at ringside, watching the door through which Marcus had disappeared and wondering exactly what kind of training the Navy had sent him. In 20 years of running this gym, he had seen plenty of military personnel come through, and none of them had demonstrated anything close to what he had just witnessed. Whatever Marcus Chen's story was, it was clearly more complicated than anyone had realized. And, tomorrow, when he returned for his next training session, the atmosphere in the gym was going to be very different than it had been today. The young man with the glasses and mild manner had just turned their understanding of military training completely upside down, and everyone in the gym was beginning to realize that they had seriously underestimated what they were dealing with. Outside in the parking lot, Marcus sat in his car for a few moments before starting the engine. He had known that this kind of thing might happen, it usually did when he was placed in civilian training environments. The gap between what people expected from basic military training and what he had actually learned was always a source of confusion and, sometimes, conflict. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he would report to his handler that the cover story was holding and that his placement in the civilian facility appeared to be successful. The mission parameters were clear, and, so far, everything was proceeding according to plan. What the people in that gym didn't know, and what he couldn't tell them, was that Marcus Chen was not just another Navy recruit sent for advanced training. His real story was far more complicated, and the skills they had just witnessed were the result of training programs that officially did not exist. But that was a conversation for another day, and probably with different people entirely. For now, he had established himself in this environment, and tomorrow the real work could begin. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with Marcus Chen pulling into the parking lot of Elite Combat Training Center at exactly 0800 hours. His military punctuality was automatic now, ingrained through years of training that went far beyond what anyone at the gym could imagine. As he stepped out of his modest sedan, he noticed several other vehicles already in the lot, including Tony's distinctive black pickup truck. Word had clearly spread about yesterday's sparring session. Through the gym's large windows, Marcus could see a larger than usual crowd for morning training. What should have been a quiet session with the dedicated early risers had apparently become something of an event. Inside, the atmosphere was markedly different from his first day. Conversations didn't stop when he entered, but they shifted in tone and direction. Instead of dismissive laughter, there were curious glances and hushed speculation about who this new guy really was. Steve Martinez approached almost immediately, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that suggested a sleepless night spent thinking about the previous day's events. "Chen," he said, his tone more respectful than it had been 24 hours earlier. "I've been thinking about your training program. Maybe we should start you off with some of our more advanced groups instead of the beginner sessions." Marcus adjusted his gym bag and nodded politely. "Whatever you think is appropriate, sir. I'm here to learn." "Yeah, about that," Steve continued, lowering his voice slightly. "I've been in this business for 20 years. I've trained with ex-military guys, former police, professional fighters, even some people with backgrounds I'm not supposed to ask about. What you showed yesterday, that wasn't standard military training." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tony and his two friends from the previous day. Tony looked like he had spent the night nursing both his bruised body and his wounded pride. His approach was more cautious than before, but there was still an undercurrent of challenge in his posture. "Morning, military boy," Tony said, his tone attempting casual indifference but not quite achieving it. "Ready for round 2, or was yesterday just beginner's luck?" Marcus turned to face him, his expression remaining neutral and polite. "Good morning. I hope you're feeling better today." This response clearly wasn't what Tony had expected. He had come prepared for either cockiness or intimidation, but Marcus's genuine concern for his well-being seemed to deflate his aggressive energy. "I'm fine," Tony muttered. "Better than fine. Yesterday was just me taking it easy on the new guy. Today we do this seriously." Steve stepped between them. "Hold on there, Tony. Let's not turn my gym into some kind of grudge match arena. We've got actual training to do here." "It's all right," Marcus said quietly. "If Tony wants to continue our training from yesterday, I'm happy to help. But maybe we should make it more instructional. Other people might benefit from watching different techniques." This suggestion created an interesting dynamic. Tony couldn't back down without losing face, but Marcus had just positioned the encounter as an educational opportunity rather than a personal challenge. Several other fighters had gathered around, clearly interested in seeing a rematch but also curious about learning something new. Steve considered this for a moment. "All right, we'll make it a demonstration. Tony, you represent our traditional approach: size, strength, aggressive pressure. Chen, you show us whatever it is they taught you in the Navy. Everyone else watches and learns. No ego, no personal vendettas, just training." The group moved toward Ring 3, which was larger and better positioned for observation. Word spread quickly through the gym, and soon nearly 30 people had gathered around the ring. This was clearly the largest audience for a training session that the facility had seen in quite some time. As they prepared, Marcus noticed something that made him slightly uncomfortable. In the crowd were two men he hadn't seen the day before, both wearing civilian clothes but carrying themselves with the distinct bearing of military or intelligence personnel. They were observing with the kind of focused attention that suggested this wasn't casual interest in a gym demonstration. Marcus made a mental note to identify them later while focusing on the immediate situation. Steve was explaining the format to the gathered crowd. What we're going to see here is two different approaches to combat training. Tony represents traditional martial arts and sport fighting adapted for real-world situations. Chen is going to show us what modern military training looks like. Pay attention to the differences in technique, strategy, and mindset. As the fighters touched gloves and moved to their starting positions, Marcus found himself in an interesting situation. Yesterday's fight had been about establishing himself in a new environment. Today's demonstration would be about education, which meant he could be more open about showing techniques while still maintaining his cover story. The fight began with Tony immediately implementing a more measured approach than his previous aggressive rush. He had clearly spent time thinking about yesterday's defeat and had developed a strategy based on using his physical advantages more carefully. Tony moved forward with disciplined pressure, throwing combinations that were technically sound and well-timed. His footwork was better, his defense more careful, and his overall approach more tactical than emotional. The crowd murmured appreciation for the improvement in his technique. Marcus responded by demonstrating a completely different fighting philosophy. Instead of the sport-oriented exchanges that characterize most gym training, he showed movement patterns designed around real-world combat scenarios. His positioning prioritized ending fights quickly rather than accumulating points, and his techniques targeted vulnerabilities that would be effective against larger, stronger opponents. Notice how Chen's not trying to win rounds, Steve called out to the watching crowd. He's looking for opportunities to end the fight entirely. That's a different mindset than competitive fighting. The demonstration continued with Marcus showing various techniques while providing brief explanations of their applications. He demonstrated how to deal with size disadvantages, how to create openings against aggressive opponents, and how to transition between striking and grappling in ways that maximized effectiveness while minimizing risk. Tony, to his credit, was learning rapidly and asking good questions. The previous day's humiliation had apparently motivated him to approach this as a genuine learning opportunity rather than an ego battle. How do you generate that much power from such short movements? Tony asked after Marcus demonstrated a series of close-range strikes that had significant impact despite appearing minimal. It's about timing and targeting rather than force, Marcus explained. In real situations, you might not have room for big movements, so you learn to be effective within limited space. The crowd was clearly fascinated by the technical differences between what they were used to seeing and what Marcus was demonstrating. Several of the more experienced fighters were taking notes, both mental and actual. After about 20 minutes of technical demonstration, Steve called for a break. All right, everyone, let's process what we've seen. Tony, good adaptation to different techniques. Chen, excellent instruction. Questions from the audience? Multiple hands went up immediately. The questions ranged from technical details about specific moves to broader questions about training philosophy and applications. Marcus answered carefully, providing useful information while avoiding anything that might reveal more about his background than was appropriate. One of the questions came from a fighter Marcus hadn't met yet, a woman in her 30s with the scarred hands of someone who had spent years in serious training. Chen, what you're showing us looks like it comes from military training, but it's more sophisticated than what most veterans can demonstrate. Where exactly did you learn this? This was the question Marcus had been expecting and dreading. His cover story was solid but couldn't withstand detailed scrutiny from people with relevant experience. Advanced Navy training programs, he said simply. Some of what I learned isn't really appropriate for civilian demonstration, so I'm showing you the foundational concepts that anyone can use. It was a good answer that was technically true while avoiding specifics that might create problems. But Marcus noticed that the two military-looking observers were paying particularly close attention to his response. The training session continued with Marcus working with several different partners, demonstrating adaptations for various body types and skill levels. His teaching was clear and patient, and he seemed genuinely interested in helping others improve their capabilities. During a water break, Tony approached him with a very different attitude than he had shown previously. Look, man, I owe you an apology, Tony said, his voice quiet enough that others couldn't hear. Yesterday I was being an ass, trying to show off for everyone. You could have really hurt me, but you didn't.
That shows more class than I deserve. Marcus appreciated the honesty. No apology needed.
Every training environment has its culture, and I understand that new people need to prove themselves.
You were just doing what you thought was right.
Still, Tony continued, I'd like to learn more about what you're doing. That stuff you showed today could help a lot of people here, and I'm tired of being the gym bully who beats up on new guys just because I can.
This was an interesting development.
Marcus had expected continued hostility or at least wariness, but Tony's willingness to learn and change his approach suggested character that wasn't immediately apparent during their first encounter.
I'd be happy to work with you, Marcus replied.
But, remember, this stuff is designed for situations where you really need to protect yourself or others.
It's not sport fighting, and it comes with different responsibilities.
Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of one of the military-looking observers. He was a man in his 40s with gray temples and the kind of presence that suggested significant authority and experience. Excuse me, Chen, the man said, his tone polite but carrying an undercurrent of command authority.
I'm wondering if I could speak with you privately for a moment.
Marcus felt his situational awareness increase immediately. This was either a coincidence, which seemed unlikely, or his presence here had attracted attention from people who might recognize what they were seeing. Of course, Marcus replied, his tone remaining casual while his mind began running through contingency plans. They moved to a quieter area of the gym, away from the main training areas but still within sight of the other members. The man's bearing became even more obviously military once they were alone. I'm Colonel James Harrison, U.S. Army, the man said, keeping his voice low.
I've been watching your demonstrations, and I have some questions about your background that I'd like to discuss.
Marcus maintained his relaxed posture while internally shifting to a higher state of alertness. I'm happy to answer what I can, sir, but I should mention that some aspects of my training have classification restrictions. Colonel Harrison smiled slightly, an expression that suggested he knew more than he was initially revealing.
I figured as much.
See, the thing is, I've spent 30 years in various military training programs, including some very specialized ones. What you've been demonstrating today shows training that goes well beyond standard Navy programs. This was exactly the kind of attention that Marcus's superiors had hoped to avoid. His cover story was designed to deflect casual interest, not detailed inquiry from someone with the background to recognize advanced special operations training. Sir, I can tell you that the Navy has some programs that aren't widely known, and I was fortunate enough to be selected for advanced training before this assignment. Beyond that, I'd need to refer you to my chain of command for specifics. Colonel Harrison nodded, his expression indicating that this response was about what he had expected.
Fair enough.
But I want you to know that if you're who I think you might be, there are people who would be very interested in having a conversation with you.
I'm not sure I understand, sir.
Let me be more direct, the colonel continued. I've seen SEAL training, Delta Force demonstrations, and various other special operations programs. What you showed in there today suggests training that's even more specialized than that. If you're operating undercover for some reason, I respect that, but if you need support or resources, there are channels available.
This conversation was moving into dangerous territory.
Marcus needed to extract himself without creating suspicion while also gathering information about what Colonel Harrison might know or suspect. I appreciate your concern, sir, but I'm just here for the training assignment I was given. I'm not operating under any special cover, and I don't need any additional support beyond what my normal chain of command provides. Colonel Harrison studied him for a moment longer, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card.
All right, Chen.
But, if circumstances change, or if you find yourself needing assistance that normal channels can't provide, give me a call. Sometimes people in specialized positions find themselves in situations where they need help from people who understand their world. Marcus accepted the card and glanced at it briefly. It listed Colonel Harrison as a training liaison officer with an address that suggested connections to Special Operations Command.
Thank you, sir. I'll keep that in mind.
They returned to the main training area, where the session was beginning to wind down. Marcus spent another hour working with various partners and answering questions, but he was now acutely aware that his presence here was attracting the wrong kind of attention. As the session ended and people began to disperse, Steve Martinez approached him again.
Chen, I've got to ask, are you planning to stay here for your entire training assignment, or is this just temporary?
I'm not sure yet, sir. That depends on how the training progresses and what my superiors decide about my next assignment.
Steve nodded thoughtfully. Well, whatever happens, you've definitely made an impression here.
I've got fighters asking if they can schedule private sessions with you, and I've had more interest in today's session than any single training event in the past 5 years.
This was both good and bad news.
Marcus was successfully establishing himself as a skilled instructor, which provided good cover for his presence. But the increased attention also increased the risk of someone discovering more about his background than was safe. As Marcus gathered his gear and prepared to leave, Tony approached one final time.
Hey, Chen, a few of us usually grab lunch after morning sessions. You want to join us?
Nothing fancy, just a place down the street that doesn't ask questions about why we all look like we've been punched in the face.
Marcus considered the invitation.
Building relationships with the other fighters would strengthen his cover and provide valuable information about the social dynamics of the facility. But it also meant more exposure and more opportunities for his story to be challenged.
Sure, he decided. That sounds good.
As the group of 6 fighters made their way toward the exit, Marcus noticed that Colonel Harrison and his companion were also leaving, but they were moving toward a black SUV with government plates. Whatever interest they had in him, it was clearly official rather than casual. The restaurant turned out to be a small diner that specialized in large portions and minimal questions about its customers' various injuries and bruises. The conversation around the table was relaxed and friendly, focusing mainly on training techniques, upcoming competitions, and gym politics.
Marcus found himself genuinely enjoying the company.
These were dedicated athletes who took their training seriously and respected skill regardless of where it came from.
The hostile reception from his first day was clearly not representative of the gym's overall culture.
During lunch, he learned more about the facility's background and reputation. Elite Combat Training Center apparently served a unique niche, providing high-level training to a mix of professional fighters, military personnel, law enforcement officers, and serious civilian practitioners.
Its reputation for quality training had attracted clients from across the region.
The thing about Steve's place, explained the woman who had asked the pointed questions earlier, is that he doesn't care about your background as long as you're serious about training.
We've had everyone from professional UFC fighters to federal agents come through there.
This information was useful but also concerning. If the facility regularly attracted law enforcement and federal agents, Marcus's presence might eventually be noticed by someone with the resources and authority to dig deeper into his background. As lunch concluded and the group prepared to return to their respective schedules, Tony pulled Marcus aside.
Listen, I wanted to say thanks again for how you handled things yesterday and today.
You could have made me look like a complete fool, but instead you turned it into a learning experience.
That's class.
Everyone deserves respect, Marcus replied.
And everyone has something to learn and something to teach. Tony grinned.
Man, you really do talk like military leadership training. But, I mean it, if you need anything while you're here, just ask. I know I came off as a jerk initially, but this place is usually pretty welcoming once people get to know you. As Marcus drove back to his temporary apartment, he reflected on the day's events. The training demonstration had been successful in establishing his credentials and building relationships, but it had also attracted attention from people who might recognize more than he was comfortable revealing. Colonel Harrison's appearance was particularly concerning. Military intelligence officers didn't show up at civilian gyms by coincidence, which meant either Marcus's presence had been reported to them, or they were already monitoring the facility for other reasons. That evening, Marcus submitted his daily report through encrypted channels. He described the day's training activities, the social dynamics he was observing, and the concerning appearance of what appeared to be military intelligence personnel. The response came back within hours, delivered through the same secure channels. His superiors acknowledged his concerns about Colonel Harrison but instructed him to continue the mission as planned. Additional background checks on both the colonel and the training facility would be conducted, but, for now, Marcus was to maintain his cover and continue gathering intelligence on the facility's operations and clientele. As he prepared for another day of training, Marcus reflected on the complex balancing act he was performing. He needed to be skilled enough to maintain credibility and gather useful information, but not so impressive that he attracted the wrong kind of attention from people with the resources to investigate his background. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to walk that narrow line between success and exposure. And, somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered what Colonel Harrison was reporting to his own superiors about the interesting young Navy trainee at Elite Combat Training Center. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus Chen's arrival at Elite Combat Training Center, and the rhythm of his double life had become almost comfortable. His days were spent training with increasingly skilled partners, teaching techniques that pushed the boundaries of his cover story, and carefully gathering intelligence on the facility's operations and clientele. The relationships he had built were genuine, particularly with Tony, who had become not just a training partner but something approaching a friend. The transformation in Tony's approach to training and his interactions with new students had been remarkable, and Marcus took quiet satisfaction in having contributed to that positive change. On this particular Thursday morning, Marcus arrived at the gym to find an unusual level of activity. Multiple vehicles were in the parking lot, including several he didn't recognize, and through the windows he could see a larger crowd than normal for the early session. Inside, Steve Martinez was deep in conversation with a group of men who clearly weren't regular gym members. Their bearing, their haircuts, and their coordinated movements all screamed military or law enforcement, but at a level far above what Marcus had seen during Colonel Harrison's visit.
"Chen," Steve called out as soon as he noticed Marcus's arrival. "Perfect timing.
We've got some special visitors today who are interested in observing your training methods." Marcus felt his internal alert level increase immediately while maintaining his outwardly calm demeanor. This was either an incredible coincidence or his superior's worst fears were about to be realized. The leader of the visiting group stepped forward. He was a man in his 50s with the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect and attention. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to operating at very high levels of authority. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had spent time in multiple regions.
"I'm Director Walsh. I understand you've been providing some very interesting training demonstrations here."
Marcus knew enough to recognize that someone introducing themselves only by title rather than full name and organization was operating at a level where such information was compartmentalized on a need-to-know basis. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied carefully. "I've been working with the other members here to share some techniques I learned during my Navy training." Director Walsh smiled slightly, an expression that suggested he knew more than he was initially revealing.
"Your Navy training." "Yes, we've been hearing quite a lot about your Navy training."
This was definitely not a coincidence.
"Steve," Director Walsh continued, turning to the gym owner, "would it be possible for us to observe one of Mr. Chen's training sessions?
We're always interested in learning about new approaches to combat instruction." Steve looked between Marcus and the director, clearly sensing undercurrents in the conversation that he didn't fully understand. "Of course.
Chun, would you be comfortable doing a demonstration?"
Marcus found himself in a position where refusing would create more suspicion than agreeing.
"Certainly. What kind of demonstration would be most useful?"
"Something that shows your teaching methods," Director Walsh said.
"Perhaps working with multiple students of different skill levels."
"We're particularly interested in how you adapt military techniques for civilian applications." As the group moved toward one of the larger training areas, Marcus noticed that the visiting team had positioned themselves with clear sightlines to all exits and were maintaining positions that would allow them to control the space if necessary. These were definitely not casual observers. Tony and several other regular students had gathered for what they expected to be a normal training session, but the presence of the serious-looking visitors was creating an atmosphere of tension and curiosity. "All right," Marcus said, deciding to proceed as if this were indeed a normal training session. "Today we're going to work on adapting techniques for different physical capabilities and threat scenarios. He began with basic movement drills, showing how the same fundamental principles could be applied by people of varying sizes and strength levels. His teaching was clear and methodical, building concepts systematically while providing practical applications that the students could immediately understand and implement. The visitors observed with the kind of focused attention that suggested they were evaluating more than just teaching techniques. Marcus was acutely aware that every movement, every word, and every demonstration was being assessed by people who clearly had the background to recognize what they were seeing. As the session progressed, Marcus found himself walking an increasingly narrow line. The techniques he was demonstrating were sophisticated enough to be impressive and useful, but he had to avoid anything that would definitively identify him as having training beyond what his cover story could support. About 30 minutes into the demonstration, Director Walsh stepped forward. "Mr. Chen, that's very interesting. Would you mind showing us how you would handle a scenario involving multiple attackers? Something that might be more similar to real-world applications?" This request was clearly a test. Dealing with multiple attackers required training and mindset that went well beyond standard military combat instruction or civilian self-defense classes. "Certainly," Marcus replied, though he knew this was dangerous territory. "Tony, could you get 2 other volunteers? We'll set up a scenario where someone needs to create space and exit from a surrounded position." As Tony recruited volunteers, Marcus noticed that one of the visitors had moved to a position where he could record the demonstration with a small device. Whatever this was about, it was being documented for later analysis. The scenario Marcus set up was carefully chosen to demonstrate legitimate defensive concepts without revealing the full extent of his capabilities. He showed how to identify the primary threat, create movement opportunities, and disengage from a dangerous situation rather than trying to fight multiple opponents. His execution was smooth and efficient, neutralizing the simulated threats in a way that looked almost effortless while actually requiring extremely precise timing and technique. The volunteers found themselves controlled and positioned exactly where Marcus wanted them without entirely understanding how it had happened. The demonstration concluded with all participants unharmed and the threat scenario resolved, but the visitors were now watching Marcus with undisguised professional interest. "Very impressive," Director Walsh said, his tone suggesting this was exactly what he had expected to see. "That shows training that goes considerably beyond standard military combat programs." Marcus decided that maintaining his original story was no longer viable. "Sir, I've had some specialized training beyond basic programs, but the specifics aren't something I'm authorized to discuss in detail." "Of course not," Director Walsh replied. "And we wouldn't expect you to compromise operational security. But we would like to have a private conversation with you, if you're willing." This was the moment Marcus had been hoping to avoid since his assignment began. His cover was essentially blown, and now he had to decide how to handle the situation without compromising his mission or creating larger security problems. "I'd be happy to speak with you," Marcus said, "though I should mention that I'm currently on assignment and would need to contact my chain of command about any changes to my current duties." "We've already spoken with your chain of command," Director Walsh said quietly. "In fact, this meeting has been coordinated through appropriate channels." This revelation changed everything. Either Marcus's mission had been compromised and his superiors were extracting him, or something much larger was happening that he hadn't been briefed about. Steve Martinez, who had been listening to this exchange with growing confusion, stepped forward. "Excuse me, but what exactly is going on here? Chen, are you actually Navy, or is there something else I should know about?" Director Walsh answered before Marcus could respond. "Mr. Martinez, Mr. Chen is indeed military personnel, though his specific assignment details are classified. We appreciate your cooperation in allowing him to train here, and we want to assure you that there's nothing concerning about his presence at your facility." This explanation seemed to satisfy Steve, though he was clearly still curious about the larger situation. "Well, as long as everyone's on the up and up, you're all welcome here. Chen's been a great addition to our training programs." Director Walsh turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Chen, would you be willing to come with us for a briefing? There are some people who would like to speak with you about potential new opportunities." Marcus recognized that this wasn't really a request. "Of course, sir."
Just let me gather my gear.
As he collected his belongings, Tony approached with a concerned expression.
Hey man, is everything alright? These guys showing up like this, it feels like something serious is happening.
Marcus appreciated Tony's concern, which seemed genuine. Over the past 3 weeks, their friendship had become one of the few entirely honest relationships in his current situation.
I think it's just military bureaucracy, Marcus replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. You know how it is, someone higher up the chain wants to check on what their people are doing. Tony nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Well, if you need anything, or if this turns into some kind of problem, you've got friends here. Don't forget that. The sentiment was touching and reminded Marcus of why he had come to genuinely respect the people at this facility. They were serious about their training, loyal to their friends, and willing to stand up for what they thought was right. As Marcus left with Director Walsh's team, he was acutely aware that he was crossing a threshold. Whether this led to extraction from his current mission, reassignment to something new, or something else entirely, his time at Elite Combat Training Center was almost certainly ending. The drive took them to a nondescript office building in an area that Marcus recognized as being home to various government agencies and private contractors that worked closely with the intelligence community. The facility was unremarkable from the outside but clearly had security measures that weren't immediately visible. Inside, Marcus was led to a conference room where several other people were waiting. The group included military personnel from multiple services, civilians who clearly held significant authority, and one person whose presence surprised him considerably. "Hello, Marcus," said a familiar voice. "It's good to see you again." Commander Sarah Mitchell had been Marcus's instructor during one of his most intensive training programs, and her presence here suggested that whatever was happening was directly related to his specialized background. "Commander Mitchell," Marcus replied, coming to attention automatically. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "At ease," she said with a slight smile. "And, actually, it's Director Mitchell now. I've moved into a different role since we last worked together." Director Walsh gestured for Marcus to take a seat at the conference table. "Mr. Chen, what we're about to discuss is classified at the highest levels. Before we proceed, I need to confirm that you understand the security implications of this conversation." Marcus nodded his understanding, and Director Walsh continued. "Your performance at the training facility has been exactly what we hoped to observe. You've demonstrated the ability to maintain cover while effectively gathering intelligence, building relationships with targets, and adapting to unexpected situations. More importantly, you've shown the judgment to know when to reveal capabilities and when to maintain operational security." This suggested that his entire assignment at the gym had been a test rather than a real intelligence-gathering mission. "The truth is," Director Mitchell added, "we've been developing a new program that requires operatives with very specific skill sets. Traditional military special operations training produces excellent soldiers, but we need people who can operate effectively in civilian environments while maintaining deep cover for extended periods. Your performance over the past 3 weeks has demonstrated that you have the technical skills, the social intelligence, and the operational discipline necessary for this type of work," Director Walsh continued. "The question now is whether you're interested in taking on assignments that would utilize these capabilities." Marcus considered this carefully. The implications of what they were describing went well beyond his current training and assignment. "What kind of assignments are you talking about, sir?" "Long-term infiltration of organizations that pose national security threats," Director Mitchell explained. "Deep cover operations in environments where traditional military or law enforcement approaches aren't viable. Situations that require someone who can build genuine relationships and trust while gathering critical intelligence. The work would be challenging and potentially dangerous," Director Walsh added. "But it would also be some of the most important intelligence work being done today. Threats to national security are increasingly coming from organizations that operate in civilian environments, and we need operatives who can engage with those threats on their own terms." Marcus thought about his experience over the past 3 weeks at the gym. The relationships he had built, particularly with Tony, had been genuine despite the underlying deception of his mission.
The idea of using those relationship building skills for more significant national security purposes was both appealing and concerning.
"What would this mean for my current Navy assignment?" he asked.
"You would be transferred to a different program entirely," Director Mitchell replied. "Your military record would be adjusted to reflect the change, and your training would be significantly expanded to prepare you for this new role."
"We're not asking for an immediate decision," Director Walsh said. "This is a significant career change that would affect every aspect of your life. Take some time to consider it."
He handed Marcus a folder containing additional information. "Review these materials, and let us know your decision within 2 weeks.
If you decide to proceed, your next assignment would begin immediately.
If not, you'll return to your regular Navy duties with no negative impact on your career." As the meeting concluded, Marcus found himself in an unusual position. The past 3 weeks had shown him that he was capable of operating effectively in environments that required complex balancing of truth and deception, relationship building and intelligence gathering, genuine connection and operational objectives. The question was whether he wanted to make that kind of work his career.
Commander Mitchell walked him out of the building. "Marcus, I want you to know that this opportunity is being offered to very few people. The selection process has been extensive, and you've demonstrated capabilities that are extremely rare."
"I appreciate that, ma'am.
But I have to ask, was anything about my assignment at the gym real, or was the entire thing a test?"
She smiled slightly. "The intelligence gathering objectives were real, though not as critical as you were led to believe. But your relationships there, your training contributions, your impact on people like Tony, all of that was genuine. That's actually part of what convinced us you're right for this program." As Marcus drove back toward the gym to collect the remainder of his belongings and say goodbye to the people who had become important to him, he reflected on the complexity of the choice he was facing. The work they were describing would utilize his skills and training in ways that could have significant positive impact on national security. But it would also mean a career built on deception and relationships that could never be entirely honest. At the gym, he found Tony and Steve waiting for him with expressions of concern and curiosity. "So," Tony said directly, "are you going to tell us who you really are, or do we have to keep guessing?"
Marcus considered how to answer.
The truth was classified, but these people deserved some explanation for the sudden end to relationships they had invested in genuinely. "I'm Navy, like I told you," he said finally. "But my training and assignments are more specialized than I was able to explain initially.
Today was about my superiors evaluating whether I'm ready for new responsibilities." Steve nodded thoughtfully. "And, are you? Ready for new responsibilities, I mean?"
"I'm still deciding," Marcus replied honestly.
Tony stepped forward and extended his hand. "Well, whatever you decide, you've made a difference here. You taught me things about training and about how to treat people that I won't forget. If your new responsibilities take you away from here, I hope they're worth it."
The handshake turned into a brief embrace, and Marcus realized that regardless of what decision he made about the new program, he would carry the relationships from this place with him. That evening, alone in his apartment with the classified folder, Marcus began reading about a world of intelligence work that operated in the shadows between civilian life and national security. It was compelling, important work that would challenge him in ways his military training had only begun to prepare him for. But it was also a path that would require him to live with the kind of moral complexity that came from building genuine relationships that were also operational necessities. The decision he made would shape not just his career, but the kind of person he would become. And he had 2 weeks to decide whether he was ready for that transformation. Outside his window, the city continued its normal evening routine, unaware that decisions made in offices and conference rooms and modest apartments like his were shaping the invisible battles being fought to keep that normalcy safe. Marcus opened the folder and began to read about his potential future, knowing that whatever choice he made would change everything about his life, but confident that he had the training, the skills, and the judgment to make it responsibly.